Today, we're going to talk about a moment of profound neurobiological and psychological significance. The day the super empath walks away from the narcissist. This isn't just an emotional milestone. It's a physiological, cognitive, and even spiritual reset. It marks the end of one pattern and the beginning of another, driven by deep shifts in brain chemistry, perception, and identity. Let's begin by understanding what a super empath is. In neurobiological terms, this is someone with an exceptionally high capacity for interoception, the ability to feel and interpret the emotional states of others. This trait is often accompanied by enhanced mirror neuron activity. In plain language, these individuals feel others' pain almost as intensely as their own. They have a heightened sensitivity to emotional cues, tone, body language, and unspoken distress. Super empaths possess a uniquely heightened form of emotional attunement that goes far beyond the average capacity for empathy. This attunement isn't simply about being nice or caring. It's a deeply rooted neurobiological sensitivity to the emotional states of others. It stems from a nervous system that is finely tuned to pick up even the most subtle social and emotional cues. Changes in facial expressions, vocal tone, microexpressions, body posture, and energy shifts in a room. This sensitivity is underpinned by more active mirror neuron systems, which are responsible for the brain's ability to reflect and simulate the emotions of others. In other words, when someone is sad, angry, or joyful, the super empath doesn't just understand it intellectually, they feel it in their own body. This intense emotional resonance begins early in life. Often, super empaths grow up in environments where they were either expected to care for others emotionally due to trauma, instability, or emotional neglect, or where their natural sensitivity was the only way they could navigate unpredictable dynamics. This creates an emotional intelligence that is not simply learned through books or conversation, it is trained through survival. As they mature, super empaths develop an extraordinary capacity for compassion, intuition, and presence. They can often walk into a room and immediately sense who is hurting, who is angry but hiding it, or who feels unseen. This heightened attunement is both a gift and a burden. On the one hand, it allows super empaths to be powerful healers, listeners, leaders, and supporters. They can sit with someone's grief and not flinch. They can hold emotional space without needing to fix or flee. They often find themselves in roles where they are the emotional anchor for groups, families, or communities. Their nervous systems are wired to co-regulate others, essentially calming or matching the energy of people around them to bring balance. However, this same ability comes at a cost. Because super empaths feel so deeply, they are also more prone to emotional overload and burnout. They absorb not just the feelings, but often the emotional responsibilities of others. In relational dynamics, this makes them particularly vulnerable to people who unconsciously or deliberately offload emotional labor, such as narcissists, emotionally unavailable partners, or chronically unstable individuals. The super empath, driven by their instinct to help and connect, may keep giving, absorbing, and adjusting without realizing they are slowly eroding their own emotional boundaries. On a neurochemical level, the super empath's body is frequently in a state of heightened arousal, even if it looks calm on the outside. Their brain is constantly scanning for emotional shifts, often subconscious. This can activate the limbic system, the part of the brain involved in emotion and threat detection, more frequently than in people with less sensitive systems. Over time, if not balanced with self-care and boundaries, this leads to increased cortisol levels, the stress hormone, disrupted sleep, digestive issues, anxiety, and emotional fatigue. It's important to understand that super empaths don't just feel too much. They process emotional data more completely. Their brains register more information from an interaction, and their bodies respond more thoroughly. This can make environments that are emotionally volatile, toxic, or even subtly off balance extremely difficult for them to endure. What others might shrug off, the super empath internalizes. What others miss, they notice. And what others deflect, they often carry. Because of this, super empaths often go through cycles of deep connection, followed by deep withdrawal. They may become isolated or retreat for long periods, not because they dislike people, but because they have overextended emotionally. Their nervous systems need recalibration, silence, solitude, and grounding to discharge the emotional energy they have absorbed from others. Yet the most powerful aspect of the super empath's emotional attunement is what happens when they turn it inward. When they begin to direct the same sensitivity and care toward themselves that they so freely offer to others, a transformation begins. They start to understand the difference between empathy and enmeshment. They learn that just because they can feel someone's pain doesn't mean they are responsible for it. They begin to set boundaries, not out of coldness, but out of wisdom. They realize that their ability to feel deeply is only a gift when it is wielded with discernment. Emotional attunement at this level isn't something that can be taught in a classroom. It's lived, embodied, and refined through experience. Super empaths are not emotionally weak. They are neurologically advanced in a way that the world doesn't often recognize or reward. Their nervous systems are wired for connection, depth, and transformation. But for them to thrive, they must learn to protect and prioritize their own emotional state as fiercely as they tune into others. In a world that is increasingly loud, fast, and emotionally disconnected, the super empath's presence is a form of quiet revolution. But that revolution must begin within. When the super empath learns to honor their sensitivity as a strength, rather than a liability, their emotional attunement becomes a force, not just for connection, but for profound healing. Narcissists exploit emotional systems they don't fully feel because they operate from a fundamentally different psychological and neurobiological framework. While they may appear charismatic, emotionally intelligent, or even deeply understanding on the surface, the reality is that their ability to read emotions is primarily cognitive, not affective. In other words, they can intellectually understand what others are feeling, but they do not experience those emotions in the same embodied, compassionate way that emotionally attuned individuals do. This difference is crucial. At the core of the narcissist's psychology is a fragile and often unconscious sense of self-worth that requires constant reinforcement from the external world. This reinforcement often comes in the form of admiration, validation, control, or power over others. True, because they are not internally regulated, meaning they do not have a stable, grounded sense of self. They rely on manipulating external emotional dynamics to get their needs met. They become experts at reading people, not to connect, but to control. Their empathy, if you can call it that, is strategic. It is a tool for influence, not for care. Narcissists are often highly skilled at identifying emotional vulnerabilities in others. They can mirror back emotions, adopt language that sounds emotionally intelligent, and even act as though they deeply understand you. But behind this facade, there is no emotional reciprocity. They are not feeling with you. They are reading you. Their brains, particularly areas associated with cognitive empathy, such as the medial prefrontal cortex, may be quite active. But the areas tied to emotional empathy, such as the anterior insula and the mirror neuron system, are underactive or disconnected. This allows them to simulate empathy convincingly while lacking the visceral discomfort that true empathy often brings. This disconnect is what allows narcissists to exploit others without remorse. They can watch someone cry and appear concerned, even while they're calculating how to use that moment to their advantage. They can say all the right things in a moment of crisis, while internally feeling nothing but irritation that the attention isn't on them. And when someone confronts them or needs emotional accountability, they often deflect, gaslight, or retaliate. Because they don't feel the emotional weight of their actions, they don't carry guilt or shame in the same way others do. Instead, they often perceive emotions, especially vulnerability, as weaknesses to be exploited. One of the most insidious aspects of narcissistic behavior is the way they weaponize the emotional responses of others. They often provoke strong emotional reactions, such as anger, sadness, guilt, or fear, and then use those reactions against the person experiencing them. For example, they might push someone to the brink emotionally, then claim that person is too sensitive, a crazy, or unstable. In this way, they maintain control by destabilizing others, all while avoiding responsibility for the emotional chaos they've created. Because narcissists lack internal emotional regulation, they often create emotional dependency in others to maintain a sense of control and superiority. They do this through a cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard. In the idealization phase, they may shower someone with attention, praise, and affection. This feels intoxicating to the other person, especially someone with high emotional sensitivity, like a super empath. But this stage isn't about genuine connection. It's about hooking the person into an emotional loop. Once that connection is secured, the narcissist begins the process of devaluation, withdrawing affection, criticizing, invalidating, and subtly undermining the other person's confidence. This shift is confusing and painful, but it's also designed to make the person work harder to regain the narcissist's approval. In the early stages, the narcissist or manipulative partner often floods the empath with attention, affection, and admiration. This love bombing phase is not genuine connection, it is the hook. The empath's brain releases dopamine and oxytocin, two neurochemicals associated with pleasure, bonding, and trust. It feels like falling in love, but in reality, it is the beginning of emotional conditioning. Once the narcissist senses that the empath is emotionally invested, the dynamic subtly shifts. Affection becomes inconsistent. One day there is warmth and closeness. The next day, coldness or distance. Praise turns into criticism. Vulnerability is met with dismissal. The empath, who is deeply sensitive to emotional shifts, starts to feel anxious, unsure, and self-blaming. They try harder to get it right, to fix what they believe must be a problem in themselves. They analyze their words, their tone, their behavior, hoping to bring back the warmth that once felt so real. But this warmth is now doled out strategically and unpredictably. The empath never knows when it will return, and so they become stuck in a loop of trying, hoping, and doubting. This is the trauma bond. It is not simply an unhealthy attachment. It is a neurological trap. The empath becomes chemically addicted to the cycle of highs and lows. Much like a gambler addicted to the thrill of a potential win, the emotional reward becomes more powerful because it is rare. The less it is given, the more it is craved. Each fleeting moment of kindness or validation feels magnified in its impact, making the pain of the lows seem like an unfortunate cost rather than a warning sign. Compounding the issue is the empath's own nature. Super empaths, in particular, are wired to seek harmony, to repair, to understand, and to connect deeply. They often believe that with enough patience, love, or insight, they can reach the other person's true self, the one they saw during the love bombing phase. They don't realize that what they are trying to reach was never a stable version of the narcissist, but a carefully constructed mask. The empath remains in the cycle because they believe the good times are the real person and the bad times are temporary. In reality, it's the cycle itself that is the reality, and the good moments are the bait. Over time, this pattern causes significant psychological and physiological harm. The empath's nervous system becomes dysregulated. Cortisol, the stress hormone, stays elevated. The brain enters a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for signs of emotional danger or reward. Sleep becomes disturbed. Self-worth erodes, and a deep sense of confusion and anxiety takes root. Even when the empath intellectually understands that the relationship is damaging, their body and brain continue to crave the intermittent connection. They may even feel more bonded to the manipulator during periods of cruelty or absence, because the pain intensifies the longing, and the longing makes the brief moments of affection feel overwhelmingly powerful. What makes this cycle so dangerous is that it undermines the empath's ability to trust their own perceptions. They begin to doubt their reality. Gaslighting from the manipulative partner reinforces this doubt, causing the empath to feel crazy, overly sensitive, or incapable of functioning without the abuser's approval. This loss of self-trust is a key component of the trauma bond because it keeps the empath from leaving. So they stay not because they don't see the damage, but because they can't clearly determine where the damage ends and their own responsibility begins. Breaking free from this pattern requires more than logic. It requires nervous system healing. The empath must not only understand the manipulation, they must retrain their brain to stop associating emotional pain with love. This is a slow and deliberate process. It involves no contact or reduced contact, rebuilding self-trust, and regulating the body through practices like deep breathing, sleep repair, trauma-informed therapy, and the gradual reintroduction of safe reciprocal relationships. Intermittent reinforcement is powerful precisely because it mimics the rhythms of hope and despair. But once the empath sees the pattern clearly, not as a reflection of their worth, but as a psychological manipulation, the spell begins to break. And when that bond is broken, not just emotionally, but neurochemically, the empath begins to reconnect with their original sensitivity, no longer as a vulnerability to be exploited, but as a strength to be protected. Chronic stress leads to emotional and physiological degradation through a cascade of biological, neurological, and psychological processes that erode both mental well-being and physical health over time. When the body is exposed to stress in short bursts, it responds adaptively, activating the fight or flight response, increasing alertness, and mobilizing energy to deal with immediate threat. But when stress becomes chronic, persistent, or inescapable, especially emotional stress rooted in dysfunctional relationships or environments, the systems designed to protect us become the very forces that cause harm. At the core of the body's stress response is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, a complex set of interactions between the brain and endocrine system. When a person perceives a threat, whether physical or emotional, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which in turn stimulates the adrenal glands to release cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones prepare the body to respond by increasing heart rate, elevating blood pressure, tightening muscles, and sharpening focus. In the short term, this is life-saving. But when the body is kept in this heightened state for days, weeks, or months, it begins to break down. One of the first systems to suffer is emotional regulation. The brain, particularly the amygdala, the part responsible for detecting threats, becomes hyperactive. In contrast, the prefrontal cortex, which governs rational thinking, emotional regulation, and decision-making, becomes less active. This imbalance means the person becomes more reactive, more easily overwhelmed, and less able to calm down or make thoughtful choices. Irritability, anxiety, sadness, and emotional exhaustion become regular features of daily life. The person may feel on edge all the time, unable to relax or feel safe, even in neutral environments. Sleep becomes disrupted. Chronic stress interferes with the brain's ability to transition into deep restorative sleep. The result is poor quality rest, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, and waking up feeling tired. Over time, this sleep deprivation compounds stress, creating a vicious cycle where the body and mind never get a chance to recover. The emotional toll of sleep disruption is profound. It impairs memory, lowers frustration tolerance, and heightens emotional sensitivity, making everyday challenges feel insurmountable. Cognitive function also begins to deteriorate. High levels of cortisol can damage the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for learning and memory. Concentration becomes difficult. Tasks that were once simple may feel overwhelming. The person may become forgetful, indecisive, or mentally foggy. This cognitive decline often leads to further frustration and self-doubt, especially in people who are otherwise high-functioning. The stress affects not only how they feel, but how they see themselves. Physiologically, chronic stress weakens the immune system. Elevated cortisol suppresses immune function, making the body more vulnerable to illness and infection. People under constant stress often report getting sick more frequently, recovering more slowly, or experiencing flare-ups of autoimmune conditions. Inflammation increases throughout the body, contributing to a host of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, diabetes, gastrointestinal disorders, and even some cancers. The digestive system, in particular, is deeply impacted by chronic stress. The gut and brain are closely connected through the gut-brain axis. Stress can disrupt the balance of the gut microbiome, impair digestion, and cause or exacerbate issues like IBS, acid reflux, bloating, and food sensitivities. When the nervous system is constantly in fight or flight mode, digestion is deprioritized. The result is poor nutrient absorption and gastrointestinal discomfort, further depleting the body's energy reserves and increasing inflammation. Emotionally, people under chronic stress often lose touch with their sense of self. They may feel like they are surviving rather than living. Joy becomes rare, creativity fades. Relationships suffer as patience runs thin and the capacity for connection diminishes. Chronic stress can distort perception, making it difficult to see situations clearly. The person may become hypervigilant or numb, alternating between feeling too much and nothing at all. Emotional burnout becomes a constant companion, a dull ache in the background of daily life. In relational contexts, such as toxic work environments or emotionally abusive partnerships, the chronic stress is not just internal, it is relational. The stress is sustained not by external threats, but by ongoing emotional instability, unpredictability, invalidation, and lack of safety. The body does not know how to come down from its alert state because the threat is not resolved. The result is a chronic sense of unsafety that permeates every aspect of life. Even moments of peace may feel suspicious or fleeting. The nervous system remains stuck in a state of hyperarousal or collapse, unable to reset. Recovery from chronic stress requires more than rest. It requires deliberate recalibration of the nervous system. This includes practices that activate the parasympathetic nervous system, such as deep breathing, mindfulness, consistent sleep routines, somatic therapies, physical movement, and healthy social connect. But perhaps most importantly, it requires the removal or restructuring of the sources of stress, setting boundaries, ending toxic relationships, shifting environments, or changing internal belief systems that perpetuate stress responses. Chronic stress doesn't just wear down the body and mind, it rewires them. But the good news is that with time and intentional care, they can be rewired again, this time toward resilience, calm, and genuine well-being. The path to healing is not just about managing stress, but about transforming the systems that allowed it to become chronic in the first place. The turning point is a neurobiological override, a moment when the brain, after enduring prolonged emotional and physiological strain, initiates a survival-based shift that overrides habitual patterns of attachment, fear, and dependency. This override is not always loud or dramatic. Often it begins as a subtle change in perception, a sudden absence of emotional reactivity, or an inner clarity that feels unfamiliar but undeniable. It is the nervous system deciding after repeated threat exposure and depletion that enough is enough. This is not a conscious decision in the traditional sense. It is the body's wisdom, asserting itself after too much cortisol, too much adrenaline, too much betrayal, and too little safety. When a person remains in a toxic or chronically stressful environment, particularly one marked by emotional manipulation, trauma bonds, or intermittent reinforcement, their nervous system is locked in survival mode. The amygdala remains on high, alert, scanning for threats. The sympathetic nervous system stays activated, constantly preparing the body to fight, flee, or freeze. Over time, this dysregulation becomes the baseline. The person adapts to the chaos, normalizing exhaustion, emotional volatility, and self-doubt. They may remain in the situation not out of weakness, but because their brain has been conditioned to associate unpredictability with love and stability with danger or loss. But the nervous system has limits. There comes a point when the body's internal warning system can no longer sustain the dysfunction. The override occurs when the brain's effort to preserve connection becomes secondary to its mandate to preserve life. This is the tipping point. It often follows a seemingly ordinary moment, a final broken promise, a look of contempt, a subtle act of betrayal, but internally, the cost becomes too high. Something shifts. The emotional bond that once felt like survival now registers as threat. The system no longer seeks to repair. It seeks to escape. Neurobiologically, the shift involves a recalibration of the autonomic nervous system, where the sympathetic system once dominated, pushing the person to stay hyperalert in hopes of regaining control. Now the parasympathetic system, particularly the dorsal vagal branch, may step in to create emotional distance. This is a kind of protective numbing, a biological disconnection that allows the person to see the relationship or environment for what it is rather than what they wish it could be. It is the brain pulling resources away from the emotional investment in order to conserve energy and protect the self. This moment often feels like a strange calm. The tears stop. The rumination quiets. The urge to explain, fix, or wait for change dissolves. What replaces it is not rage or despair, but neutrality, a clear, detached awareness that continuing to stay is no longer viable. The override may feel cold or mechanical, but it is deeply intelligent. It is the body reclaiming agency from the psychological patterns that have kept the person tethered to dysfunction. This turning point may also be accompanied by a release of internalized shame. For months or years, the person may have believed that they were the problem, that if they were more patient, more loving, more forgiving, things would improve. But in this neurobiological override, the illusion breaks. The brain no longer prioritizes empathy for the abuser. It prioritizes truth. And the truth, once seen through the lens of a regulated nervous system, often looks very different. The manipulations become visible. The emotional games, the gaslighting, the inconsistency, all of it begins to register not as complex or unresolvable, but as unhealthy and unacceptable. Cognitively, this moment can feel like dissonance resolving into clarity. The prefrontal cortex, long inhibited by stress hormones and emotional chaos, begins to reassert control. The person can think more clearly, assess risk more accurately, and remember past events without the fog of emotional distortion. They may begin to see patterns, repetitions of behavior that once felt isolated now reveal themselves as systemic. The override restores narrative coherence. And with that coherence comes the ability to make decisions rooted in self-preservation rather than fear. Physiologically, the body may still carry the aftermath of long-term stress. There may be fatigue, adrenal depletion, tension, or even illness. But for the first time, the person is no longer fighting against their own instincts. The override doesn't mean instant healing, but it creates the conditions for healing to begin. The nervous system is no longer defending the abuser or the trauma. It is defending the self. This is where the real work starts. Rebuilding identity, restoring boundaries, and reestablishing safety from the inside out. The turning point is not a miracle moment. It is a biological threshold, crossed after repeated breaches of trust and accumulations of emotional injury. But it is also proof of the body's resilience and intelligence. The brain will hold on as long as it believes there is hope for safety or resolution. But once it registers the environment as a consistent source of threat, it begins to shut down the pathways that maintain attachment. This is not detachment born of indifference. It is detachment born of survival. When the override happens, the person may feel confused at how sudden and final it feels. But that finality is earned. It is the result of thousands of moments when the nervous system warned, signaled, pleaded, and was ignored. The override is the body saying, you may not feel ready to walk away, but I am. It is the beginning of a return to self, not just emotionally, but biologically. The override is the first step toward a life where safety, clarity, and emotional reciprocity are not only possible, but non-negotiable. Walking away initiates physiological healing and identity reformation because it marks the end of ongoing threat exposure and the beginning of nervous system recalibration. When a person steps out of a chronically stressful, toxic, or emotionally manipulative relationship, the body finally receives a signal it has long awaited. The danger is over. This signal sets in motion a series of changes, not just emotional, but neurobiological, hormonal, and structural, that enable the person to reclaim both their physical health and their sense of self. For as long as someone remains in an unsafe environment, whether it's a relationship characterized by gaslighting, intermittent reinforcement, or emotional neglect, the body is caught in a loop of hypervigilance and dysregulation. The nervous system stays activated, cortisol and adrenaline continue circulating, and the body's repair systems are suppressed. Emotional stress doesn't just stay in the mind, it gets stored in the body. Muscles remain tense, digestion slows. The immune system weakens and sleep becomes shallow and inconsistent. Over time, this produces a baseline of exhaustion, anxiety, and depletion. Even if the person doesn't consciously register themselves as stressed, their body continues to live in survival mode. The act of walking away interrupts this cycle. When physical or emotional distance is created from the source of stress, the body begins to interpret that space as safety. This doesn't happen all at once. Initially, the person may still be flooded with fear, confusion, guilt, or doubt, but beneath those surface-level thoughts and feelings, deeper shifts are occurring. The sympathetic nervous system starts to dial down. The parasympathetic nervous system, particularly the ventral vagal branch, which is responsible for feelings of calm, connection, and social engagement, starts to re-engage. The body begins to release the grip of fight or flight and moves toward rest and digest. This shift has immediate physiological consequences. Heart rate begins to stabilize. Breathing deepens. Muscles begin to relax. Sleep improves. The digestive system starts to function more normally. The immune system regains its capacity to defend and repair. These are the first signs of healing. Not necessarily emotional clarity, but physical regulation. The body is always the first to know what safety feels like, and its recovery lays the foundation for emotional repair. As the body stabilizes, the brain follows. In a toxic or emotionally unpredictable environment, the amygdala is hyperactive and the prefrontal cortex is inhibited. This imbalance makes it hard to think clearly, evaluate situations logically, or make consistent decisions. After walking away, as the stress hormone load decreases, the prefrontal cortex regains function. Cognitive fog begins to lift. The person can start to think critically about the past, make new plans, and imagine different futures. Memory consolidation improves, allowing them to make sense of what they've experienced not just through emotion, but through insight. This new clarity fuels identity reformation. In relationships where chronic emotional stress is present, especially with narcissistic dynamics, the person often loses their sense of self. Their boundaries become blurred. Their preferences are overridden. Their voice is minimized. Their reality is questioned so often that they begin to question it themselves. Walking away creates the distance necessary to differentiate between the internalized voice of the manipulator and the authentic self that had been silenced. Rebuilding identity is not about reverting to who the person was before the trauma. It's about integrating the lessons of survival into a stronger, more rooted self. This process involves questioning beliefs that were absorbed during the toxic relationship, beliefs about worth, love, strength, and trust. It involves developing a new internal framework, one that isn't based on pleasing others or avoiding conflict, but on living in alignment with one's own values, needs, and boundaries. The physiological healing that supports this process also enables deeper emotional work. As the nervous system becomes more regulated, the person becomes better equipped to feel difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. They can process grief, anger, betrayal, and loss without disassociating or collapsing into shame. They can hold their pain without becoming it. This emotional resilience grows from biological safety, and it allows for new emotional experiences like joy, curiosity, and connection to emerge. Relationships take on new meaning in this phase. After walking away, many people reevaluate what intimacy, respect, and safety look like. Their tolerance for dysfunction drops dramatically. They begin to recognize red flags not as intriguing or familiar, but as unacceptable. Their body, now more attuned to regulation, starts to reject what once felt like love, but was really trauma in disguise. They seek relationships that are mutual, stable, and emotionally reciprocal, not because they have memorized what those qualities look like, but because their nervous system has recalibrated to recognize them as safe. There are setbacks, emotional relapses, and moments of nostalgia, but the trajectory is forward each time the person honors their body's cues, reinforces their boundaries, or speaks their truth without apology. They reinforce the new identity, one rooted in autonomy, clarity, and self-trust. The physical healing and emotional integration support each other in a continuous feedback loop, guiding the person into deeper wholeness. Walking away is not just about leaving someone else, it is about returning to oneself. It is the moment the body and mind stop surviving and start healing. And from that healing emerges a self not diminished by pain, but deepened by it. The person who walks away does not walk out broken. They walk into a new kind of strength. A strength that is quieter, steadier, and rooted in something no one else can touch. The self that knows safety, the self that knows truth, and the self that will never settle for less again.